Good morning, everyone. In this week's Torah portion, Moshe Rabbeinu, in his farewell address to the Jewish people, tells the Jewish people, remember the great miracles, the wonders that you have experienced as a nation, and make sure you never forget it and you relate it to your children and grandchildren from generation to generation. And Moses goes on to say, has any other nation witnessed the mighty, powerful hand of God, the experiences of the Exodus from Egypt, as God took one nation from the midst of another nation with wonders and with signs. And then he says, God brought you to Mount Sinai. And then Moses says, has any other nation ever heard the voice of God amidst the fire as you have seen and heard and experienced? And the last word of the verse is, Vayechi, and you lived and you survived. And the question is, what is Moses emphasizing with the final word of the verse? Has anyone witnessed such miracles and wonders, Vayechi, and survived and lived? And perhaps what Moses was saying to the Jewish people, there are many nations that have great tales and great stories in their past, in their histories. Wonders, miracles, phenomenons, accomplishments. But you are the only nation that survived and lived to tell the story. The Jewish people are the only great-great-grandchildren of those who actually experienced these miracles thousands of years ago. Tomorrow night is Tisha B'Av, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. Jews around the world will sit on the ground and mourn the destruction of the temple, both temples that occurred thousands of years ago. But even though it's the saddest day of national mourning for the Jewish people, in the prophets, it's referred to as a moed, as a holiday. And the question is, why is it a holiday? It's a sad day. And our rabbis explain, because God destroyed the temple, which is made out of stone and wood, but he did not destroy the Jewish people. And so even though it's the saddest day and we mourn the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem and the exiles by the Babylonians and then by the Romans, we still call it a holiday, because the miracle of Jewish survival, and that we are here to tell the story of our ancestors from 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, that is something worth celebrating, even in the midst of the greatest sadness. Last week, Dini and I were in Athens, and we went to the Acropolis, and thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of tourists flocked to see the ancient Pantheon and the Acropolis built by the great Greek mythological religion thousands of years ago to worship their gods. But I was reminded of the story of Ambassador Yaakov Herzog, who in the 1960s was invited to debate a professor at McGill University by the name of Professor Arnold Toynbee. And Professor Toynbee asserted that Israel had stolen the land from the Palestinians and committed atrocities and didn't have a right to the land of Israel. And Yaakov Herzog turned to Professor Toynbee and said, let me ask you the following question. Imagine if a big Olympia plane lands in Athens, and out comes a very old man, and the porter at the airport says, welcome to Athens. What's your name? And he says, my name is Socrates. And then the man says, tell me, what language are you speaking? And the porter says, I'm speaking modern Greek. He says, what about ancient Greek that I spoke? He says, we no longer speak that here. We study it in university, but we don't speak ancient Greek. He said, take me to the temple of Zeus. And the porter says, it doesn't exist anymore as a temple, it's just a tourist attraction. He says, take me to the Acropolis so I could worship the mythological gods. And they say to Socrates, that no longer is what we worship today. We have the Greek Orthodox Church, which is a completely different religion. Socrates walks out onto the streets of Athens and he says, where are the gods of Greece, of Greek mythological past that lined the streets of Athens? He says, we no longer worship them anymore. Then Yaakov Herzog said to Professor Toynbee, imagine now a second plane lands in Italy, and out comes a very old man. And the porter says, welcome, what's your name? He says, my name is Julius Caesar. He says, welcome. He says, what language are you speaking? He says, I'm speaking Italian. He says, what about Latin? We spoke Latin here thousands of years ago. He says, well, that's an ancient language that we no longer speak. We speak modern day Italian. He says, okay, take me to the Colosseum. He says, the Colosseum is just a tourist attraction now. He says, but now imagine a third plane, El Al, flight, lands in Ben Gurion Airport. And out comes a very old man. And the porter comes over to the old man and says, Shalom Aleichem. And this old man, whose name is Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, says, Aleichem Shalom. He says, welcome to Israel. And this old man, Moses, says, Ani Moshe, I am Moshe. What's your name? He says, Gam Ani Moshe, I'm also Moses. And Moshe, and the original Moshe says, I was born in Egypt. Where were you born? He says, I was born here in Tel Aviv. He says, tell me, I forgot to bring my tefillin. Do you have a pair of tefillin? And the porter from Israel says, sure. He rolls up his sleeve. He shows him the marks of the tefillin that he just put on this morning. He says, I have a pair of tefillin here in my locker. And he loans him a pair of tefillin. He says, take me to the place of the Holy Temple. And he takes him to the Kotel. And it's no longer just a tourist attraction, but they're actually Jews praying with the same tefillin and talis, doing the mitzvot as Moses commanded 3,000 years ago. And Moses goes over to Jew and says, do you know what's in the Shema? He says, of course, we have in the tefillin we have the Shema, the declaration of faith in God. And in the last paragraph, we talk about the exodus from Egypt through Moshe Rabbeinu. And Yaakov Herzog said to Professor Toynbee, tell me, are there any other nation that has more of a claim and a right to the land of Israel than the Jewish people? We are the actual descendants of our ancestors who were the first inhabitants of this land 3,300 years ago. And Judaism was a religion 2,000 years before Islam was born even. How can you say that we don't have a right to this land? Tomorrow night we begin the 24 hours of mourning. But Moses tells us in this week's Parsha, never has there been a nation that has witnessed the miracles you have witnessed, Vayechi, but you lived to tell the story of your ancestors. Have a wonderful day.